But not all sins are crimes. If all sins were crimes, everybody in this room ought to be in jail or executed. Not all sins are crimes. Simple distinction, but important. Two specific crimes condemned by the 8th commandment are mentioned in answer 110. Thefts and robberies. What's the difference? Well, a robbery is a theft plus, going along with it, the threat or use of violence. So we talk about a thief, meaning a pickpocket or a shoplifter or a cat burglar, but a robber is someone who comes armed with a knife or a gun, like the man who robs a bank. It's a hold-up. Hand over the money or I shoot you. That's how it goes. So robbery typically has a stiffer sentence than mere theft. Mere compared to robbery. Now, why do you think Lord's Day 42 on the 8th commandment begins with this distinction between crimes and sins? It's to disabuse people of the false and shallow view that the 8th commandment merely forbids the crimes of theft and robbery. Otherwise, people might reckon, well, there's one I've kept. I have never been arrested for stealing, never mind imprisoned. Tick to that one, and I've only the other 9 to keep, and I'll be all right. And of course, this false view of thou shalt not steal, that arises naturally in fallen man's darkened heart, serves man's rags of self-righteousness. Prone to think, oh, I've kept that one. Whereas the law of God is designed to be our schoolmaster to lead us to Jesus Christ. If someone thinks he's kept the 8th commandment, then there's no need for the righteousness of God in the life and cross of Christ. So Lord's Day 42 says it's not just these things. It's all these other things. And then it delves into them a whole lot more and is a lot more thorough about them. So I trust that we don't have to say a big pile more about crimes against the 8th commandment. That you're not engaging in these sort of things. That we're not going to open one of the local newspapers and read of you as convicted of shoplifting or tax evasion or any such thing. To echo Ephesians 5 from our last sermon, such things should not even be so much as named amongst us. But not only now these gross and civil offences, the 8th commandment forbids many other things. And I trust it's there especially that we must watch and guard ourselves. And so the next section of answer 110 forbids all sorts of sinful ways whereby we design to appropriate to ourselves the goods which belong to our neighbour. There are various ways you can do this. You can use force. Now we're getting somewhat near robberies. But you can use force to acquire the goods of your neighbour without actually committing a criminal offence. The school bully on the playground uses force or the threat of force to get, I don't know, your chocolate bar or your new penknife or whatever it is. But it's not a crime. It's a sin. Children in the home can use force. And they do that too. With the toys, for instance. Soldiers use force. Or at least that was a very real threat to those soldiers who came to John the Baptist of Luke 3 verse 14. John said to them, you do not intimidate people with your force of arms to shake down money out of them. And here we see the 8th commandment and the 6th commandment. The sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill, means thou shalt not use unlawful force. And so you break the sixth commandment with the threat of violence to get the goods of another, which is the eighth commandment. The next clause is this: under the appearance of right. You can use the appearance of right to appropriate the goods of your neighbour. You can change boundary markers. You can bribe police officers or judges. I trust you can't actually, and that they'll not be corrupt, but that's the way in which it is frequently done, so that they then vindicate you. The law then is twisted, so that you then gain through your corrupting of them. And then there's unjust weights, ells, or measures. And the prophets especially railed against this sin. And this is a particularly dodgy sort of area in days and societies where standard measurements are harder to obtain. With an electronic balance, unless someone does quite a complicated piece of electronic fancy footwork, it's much more difficult. But if you're in the middle of Africa, let's say, and you're weighing your bananas or some other form of fruit on scales with little lumps of metal or rock, a little bit more room for scope there. And you see how it goes on. You have one measurement when you are selling, and you have a different measurement when you are buying. So at each time you cream off a little bit for yourself. You could think of this too. Let's say if you were a shop owner in the olden days when you were selling sweets by the quarter, and instead of putting a little quarter-pound weight on the scales to put the sweeties on the other side, you had a slightly smaller one, and then you could make your big container for the sweets go a little bit further. Well, that's just a simple illustration to show how this sort of thing goes on. Fraudulent merchandise. Selling something and it does not do exactly what it says on the tin. You water down the petrol that you sell to make it go further, that is to make yourself more money. You engage in deceitful and misleading advertising. And here the 8th commandment touches upon the 9th commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness. So you break the 9th commandment by telling lies in order to break the 8th commandment, to steal. Steal by taking what is not lawfully yours. False coins is mentioned next. We would say counterfeit money. Now today, in order to make counterfeit money, you need sophisticated machinery, somewhere to store it. So I dare say that's beyond the means of us here. But you can also be involved in this racket by circulating it, or, which is perhaps more possible for us, passing it on to others. When someone slips you one, and then you're caught with a 10 or a 20, and it breaks your heart to have to tear the thing up, or try and report it, if you think that the person who passed it on to you isn't part of the racket, but that he did it by mistake too. So then you try and filch it into the bank whenever you're next making a lodgement, let's say. And then there's usury. Usury means, in the first instance, interest charged upon a loan. However, here in the Heidelberg Catechism, when it says usury, it's not forbidding charging interest on loans of a decent, moderate, lawful sort of amount, because this is a Reformed confession, the Heidelberg Catechism, and the Reformation, as opposed to medieval Romanism, this was a big shift in society with major implications also for the trade of Northern Europe, which is more reformed, over southern Europe.